Chapter 38. A Life Built from Clarity. Freedom is usually described as a change in circumstance, a different job, a larger bank account, a calendar with more open space, a life with fewer demands and fewer interruptions. These changes can matter, sometimes dramatically, but they are not the foundation, they are surface conditions. A person can acquire them and still feel confined, because confinement is not only a matter of schedule or money, it is often a matter of inner governance, the unseen condition that determines whether life is lived directly or lived through reaction. Clarity is the opposite of reaction. It is the state in which perception is not constantly distorted by weather, story, or urgency. It is not constant calm. It is not the absence of feeling. It is the mind's ability to remain oriented to what is real while feeling moves through it. When clarity exists, action becomes simpler because the mind stops treating every moment as a negotiation. The task returns to its size. The day returns to its sequence. Choices stop being forced by impulse and start being shaped by intention. The structures that produce this clarity are not mysterious, and they are not glamorous. They are the result of repeated placement, internal and external, until a life begins to hold its shape. The inner structures are attention, separation, and continuity. The external structures are rhythm, environment, and systems that protect the mind's limited bandwidth. Neither set is sufficient alone. Inner discipline without external support often becomes brittle. External structure without inner discipline becomes performative and easily broken. Freedom emerges when both sets converge, not as a philosophy, but as a lived arrangement. The first internal structure is the simplest and the most neglected, the recognition that life occurs only where you are. This is not a poetic claim, it is the physical boundary of experience. The future is an image, and the past is a reconstruction. They influence behavior, but they are not places you can inhabit. The body cannot execute in an imagined time. It can only move now. When this becomes more than an idea, a person begins to notice how often their attention is absent while their hours are passing. The absence is rarely dramatic. It looks like planning, replaying, judging, rehearsing. It feels responsible, even prudent. Yet it often produces little beyond fatigue because energy is being spent where reality cannot be met. Presence alone does not solve the problem, because the present is not always perceived clearly. The mind brings climate into every moment, and climate bends perception before conscious thought has a chance to intervene. A heavy mood makes an ordinary task feel punishing. A subtle anxiety makes neutral interactions feel threatening. A lingering irritation sharpens the world into edges. Without understanding this, the person confuses internal weather with external terrain and begins living as if the day itself is hostile. They wait for conditions to improve, as though the only way to work is to work under a certain sky. What changes a life is not forcing the sky to change. It is refusing to let the sky decide whether the day is usable. This refusal is not stubbornness. It is a correction of authority. Emotion is powerful, but it is not a reliable ruler. It rises for reasons that are sometimes relevant and sometimes incidental. It is influenced by sleep, hunger, memory, anticipation, and unspoken tension. It does not announce these influences. It simply arrives with a conviction of truth. When the worker learns to see emotion as weather rather than terrain, they stop confusing feeling with instruction. The feeling can be acknowledged without being followed. This is where discipline stops being a fight and becomes orientation. Orientation becomes more difficult when narrative enters, because narrative gives feeling a story to live in. A sensation arises and the mind immediately assigns meaning. The meaning often sounds sophisticated: timing, readiness, prudence, self-awareness. The story does not need to be dramatic to be disabling. It only needs to persuade the person that action should wait. The mind becomes busy in a way that resembles preparation while quietly avoiding contact. It seeks certainty before beginning, even though certainty tends to be produced by beginning. The day fills with interpretation instead of movement. Narrative is seductive because it creates coherence. Coherence can feel like safety. A story explains why something is hard, why you are stuck, why today is not the day. Explanation can be comforting because it gives discomfort a shape. It is also expensive because it turns an ordinary moment of resistance into a system of belief. Belief hardens. Belief resists evidence. Once the mind believes a task requires a certain emotional state, it begins building a life that depends on that state, and that dependence becomes a quiet form of captivity. The mind then begins to worship readiness, and readiness becomes the most polite form of postponement. It uses refined language. It appears responsible. It preserves self-image by framing delay as wisdom. The cost is continuity. Each postponed beginning teaches the nervous system that beginning requires a ritual. The person becomes less capable of starting in ordinary conditions. They lose the skill of beginning without agreement for mood. Attention is what breaks this spell. Not attention as a concept, but attention as an action. To return to the task is not a feeling that happens. It is a choice that is made repeatedly. It is the refusal to keep living in commentary. It is the movement of the mind back onto the object of work, onto the sentence, the decision, the call, the drawing, the repair, the next step that exists in the real world. This return is not heroic. It is often quiet and unimpressive. That unimpressiveness is part of its power. It does not depend on intensity. It depends on contact. Contact changes the nervous system because it changes what the mind is feeding. Stress collapses awareness. It narrows the field and turns the body into a tunnel. In that tunnel, the person becomes more reactive and less intelligent. They lose access to nuance. They miss what is obvious. They overcorrect. They rush. Under pressure, a mind without training tries to control the situation by tightening. But tightening reduces perception, and reduced perception creates more mistakes, which creates more pressure. The cycle feels like reality. It is often just a mind that has lost its aperture. Trained attention reopens the aperture. It does not remove pressure. It changes the relationship to it. A person who can return to the task can also return to the present, and returning to the present tends to reveal that much of what felt overwhelming was a projection of future consequence. The task in front of you is often manageable. The fear around the task is what makes it feel unmanageable. When the mind stops feeding fear with narrative and returns to the mechanics of action, the pressure remains, but the panic often dissipates because panic thrives on vagueness, not on specifics. The mechanics of focus are quiet because they are structural rather than emotional. The mind requires an architecture: fewer open loops, fewer leaks, fewer self-inflicted interruptions. Deep work is not merely time spent, it is continuity preserved. Continuity is a condition in which attention does not have to keep reintroducing itself to the task. It is the difference between moving forward and repeatedly walking back to the start. The habit of returning, maintained over time, becomes a kind of invisibly accumulated strength. It makes the day less expensive. It makes effort feel proportionate again. This is where continuity matters more than intensity. Intensity feels satisfying because it produces immediate sensation. It can create short surges of output. It also tends to burn the nervous system. A life built on intensity requires constant emotional fuel. When the fuel is absent, the system stalls. Continuity, by contrast, is quiet. It is a small effort repeated without breaks large enough to reset the mind's relationship with the work. It does not require excitement. It requires return. Over weeks and years, continuity becomes compounding, not because the person is always working hard, but because they are rarely starting over. Compounding is not a financial metaphor here. It is a description of what repeated contact does to skill, to judgment, to trust, to identity. The mind learns what it repeatedly does. Identity is shaped by behavior that survives mood. A person becomes reliable to themselves when they have enough evidence of their own return. This evidence is stabilizing in a way that motivation never is. Motivation is weather. Evidence is terrain. When you have evidence that you can keep moving even when conditions are imperfect, you stop fearing the days when you do not feel ready. You stop treating them as interruptions in life. They become part of life. This is the point where the inner work begins producing external results that look, from the outside, like character. The stability others notice is rarely theatrical. It is the absence of volatility. It is the ability to absorb pressure without leaking it into the room. It is leadership without drama, not as a management technique, but as a consequence of inner governance. People trust the person who does not turn every problem into a performance. They trust the person who can hold a clear line when the environment becomes loud. That trust becomes influence long before it becomes a title. Decision-making changes under this steadiness. Noise distorts judgment because noise makes decisions about relieving feeling rather than meeting reality. Many bad decisions are not mistakes in analysis. They are escapes from discomfort. A person chooses the option that ends anxiety quickly rather than the option that holds up over time. A person avoids a necessary conversation because it triggers fear. A person overcommits because they feel behind. A person takes reckless risk because they are desperate for relief from uncertainty. Neutrality sharpens judgment by keeping the decision tied to structure rather than sensation. The mind can see more because it is less busy protecting itself. Pressure, then, becomes workable. A person cannot eliminate stress from serious life. Building anything real attracts friction. What changes is the relationship to intensity. The person stops treating intensity as an emergency that must be escaped. They learn to remain intact while the situation is intense. They learn to recover quickly after disturbance. The ship rights itself faster. The mind returns faster. This is not toughness in the sentimental sense. It is skill in the literal sense, a trained capacity to reorient. Authority emerges from this, not as dominance, but as reliability. Calm creates influence because it reduces uncertainty for others. It becomes a signal that the environment is being held. Charisma can attract attention. Reliability earns dependence. Dependence is the deeper form of influence because it persists when nobody is excited. It persists when things are hard and boring, when the culture wants shortcuts and drama. The calm leader does not need to create urgency to remain relevant. Their relevance is that they can function without urgency. This entire arc might seem to value neutrality as the highest state. It is not. Neutrality is the base layer that makes emotion usable again. When emotion is always interfering, it becomes the enemy, and the person becomes trapped in either suppression or surrender. When neutrality exists, emotion can be used intentionally, placed where it serves rather than disrupts. There are moments when conviction should be visible, when care should be expressed, when grief should be allowed, when anger should supply spine without poisoning language. Emotional maturity is not the absence of intensity. It is the capacity to choose intensity rather than be hijacked by it. The external structures of a clear life protect this choice. A mind can be trained and still be worn down by a careless environment. The architecture of a good day is not a rigid schedule. It is a design that reduces unnecessary decisions and reduces unnecessary intrusion. Rhythm serves as a shield because rhythm prevents emotional turbulence from accumulating. When days have a repeatable pattern, the nervous system spends less time scanning for what comes next. Predictable cycles create a kind of quiet safety in which attention can settle. Without rhythm, the mind must constantly reorient, and that constant reorientation becomes a form of chronic stress. Noise is not only sound, it is any leak of attention that forces the mind to restart. Digital intrusion is one kind of leak, but not the only kind. Social clutter is another. Internal clutter is another. The question is not whether noise exists, but how much you permit. The modern environment offers infinite permission slips to leave the task. It offers novelty, outrage, entertainment, micro-rewards, and endless small dramas that feel like life while quietly draining it. The clear worker does not fight noise with heroic willpower every hour. They design their environment so that leaving is less automatic. A life that survives bad days is built this way. It does not rely on peak states. It relies on systems that remain functional when the worker is tired, irritated, uncertain, or distracted. Processes that survive bad days are not about being rigid. They are about reducing the number of moments in which you must negotiate with yourself. The clearer the system, the fewer decisions need to be redecided. The fewer redecisions, the less opportunity for mood to hijack the day. This is how discipline becomes sustainable. It moves from being a constant internal battle to being a structure that carries you when you are not at your best. Adversity, then, becomes less of a dismantling force and more of a strengthening one. A mind that can return grows stronger through disturbance because it is repeatedly practicing the act of reorientation. The person does not become addicted to chaos, nor do they romanticize struggle. They simply become less fragile. They learn that difficulty does not require collapse. They learn that bad days do not have to be lost days. They learn that intensity can be met without panic, and that recovery can be quick. The mind becomes anti-fragile, not by hardening into numbness, but by building a reliable return. The external human outside the office benefits most from this, because inner governance does not respect boundaries between domains. A person who is emotionally reactive at work is rarely serene at home. A person who lives in narrative at work often lives in narrative everywhere. When the inner world becomes ordered, spillover occurs quietly. Relationships become less volatile because the person is less compelled to discharge emotion onto others. Conflict changes shape because responses replace reactions. Communication becomes cleaner because the person can listen without immediately defending identity. A quiet mind allows another person to exist without becoming an interruption to self-image. Burnout begins to look different when seen through this lens. Burnout is often blamed on workload alone, and workload can be crushing. Yet a significant portion of exhaustion comes from internal noise, from carrying too many narratives, from constant self-monitoring, from emotional negotiation that turns every task into a psychological event. A person can work hard and still feel intact when the mind is quiet. A person can work moderately and still feel destroyed when the mind is crowded. Emotional minimalism is not a lifestyle aesthetic. It is a reduction of internal labor that produces no output. Removing that labor makes life feel calmer without making life smaller. Sovereignty emerges from this, not as control over life, but as control over response. It is the sense that you belong to yourself rather than being constantly commandeered by sensation, by story, by pressure, by the moods of others. Self-respect follows naturally because self-respect is not something you declare, it is something you experience when your actions are aligned with your standards. Reliability becomes personal rather than performative. You become someone you can rely on, and that reliance is a form of freedom that does not depend on external circumstances. Nature's lessons sharpen these points by showing what functioning looks like without negotiation. Living systems move with timing. They do not narrate. They do not demand internal permission. They conserve, they act, they recover. Predators show patience that keeps emotion from contaminating execution. Builders of air and earth show how complex structures arise from unburdened repetition. Intelligence without agitation shows what problem-solving looks like when learning is not threatened by ego. These lessons are not romantic, they are corrective. They reveal that much of human hesitation is optional, maintained by a mind that has confused commentary with intelligence. Self-reflection and language made human beings powerful, and they also made self-interference possible at scale. Ego turned experience into a mirror that is held too close to the face. The lessons forgotten were proportionality and timing. They can be reclaimed without rejecting thought. Thought becomes useful again when it is governed, when it returns to being a tool rather than an environment you live inside. The person learns to think without spiraling, to reflect without drowning, to name feelings without turning names into cages. This is where mastery arrives, not as a ceremony, but as convergence. Emotional discipline, attention, and identity begin reinforcing each other instead of sabotaging each other. A clear worker becomes a clear builder, not because money is the point, but because wealth is what stored clarity looks like over time. Wealth begins with the mind because the mind is the place where compounding is either protected or constantly interrupted. A person who can remain steady is more valuable. A person who can remain steady is also less likely to leak money through impulse and less likely to leak opportunity through distraction. Their decisions become calmer, their systems become cleaner, their execution becomes more consistent. Over time, the external world begins reflecting the internal structure, not because life is fair, but because reality responds to sustained contact. Freedom, in this sense, is not an escape. It is a life that is no longer ruled by internal weather. It is the ability to inhabit the present without being constantly dragged into simulation. It is the ability to work without requiring emotional permission. It is the ability to feel without obeying. It is the ability to recover without collapsing into narrative. It is the ability to build without drama, to lead without making others carry your nervous system, to decide without noise, to endure pressure without panic, to return after disturbance with speed and dignity. It is a mind that can meet reality directly and repeatedly, which is the only way anything is actually built. Over time, a life like this begins to feel quieter, not because it contains fewer demands, but because fewer demands are being invented internally. The person stops multiplying events with meaning that does not help. They stop treating discomfort as a referendum. They stop outsourcing direction to mood. They stop needing every day to feel a certain way in order to be usable. The calendar may still be full. The work may still be serious. The difference is that the mind is no longer at war with the moment. There is a particular peace in realizing that clarity is not a rare mental state reserved for special circumstances. It is the result of how you place attention and how you govern interpretation. The mind becomes clearer when it stops trying to win against life through explanation and starts meeting life through contact. The clarity then becomes self-reinforcing. Clean action produces clean evidence. Clean evidence stabilizes identity. Stable identity reduces the need for narrative. Reduced narrative preserves attention. Preserved attention makes action easier to return to. The cycle is not mystical, it is structural. The world does not reward the person who feels ready, it responds to the person who returns. Return is the most honest form of power because it cannot be faked for long. It is built from small acts that survive bad conditions. It is built in silence, in ordinary minutes, in moments where nobody is applauding. Over months and years, those ordinary returns create an inner gravity. The person becomes less persuadable by their own excuses. They become less hypnotized by their own stories. They become less desperate for emotional confirmation. They can move without being pushed. That is what this book has been circling from the beginning, through climate, narrative, attention, continuity, systems, nature, and mastery. The recognition that the mind is not merely a place where feelings happen, but a place where authority is either surrendered or established. When authority is surrendered to weather, life becomes unstable and expensive. When authority is established through clarity, the same life becomes workable. The work becomes cleaner. The relationships become steadier. The wealth becomes less fragile. The person becomes less divided. A life built from clarity is not a life without storms. It is a life that no longer mistakes storms for the landscape, and no longer waits for perfect skies to begin walking. Afterword. A book like this is easiest to misunderstand if it is treated as a set of instructions. It is not an argument for becoming less human, nor a demand for constant composure. It is a description of how a mind becomes workable again when it stops treating emotion as authority and story as evidence. The point was never to eliminate weather. The point was to stop confusing weather for terrain. The present moment is ordinary and unforgiving in a specific way. It offers no special entry point. It does not reward intention without contact. It does not negotiate with mood. That can sound harsh until it is seen clearly as liberation. It means you do not have to wait for a different internal state to begin living. You have only to return and to return again until the mind learns that return is possible under imperfect conditions. If any thread runs through these chapters, it is that clarity is less a discovery than a construction. It is built through repeated attention, through restraint toward narrative, through continuity that survives low days, and through environments designed to protect what is fragile. When those elements converge, freedom stops being a fantasy about someday and becomes a quality of the day you are already in. This is where the work has always been. This is where it remains.